Hello, everyone. I'm Deb Haaland, a proud member of the Pueblo of Laguna and representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you all for this year's Justice for Women lecture. Thank you for raising these important questions and taking the time to raise awareness. These lectures serve an important role in furthering the conversation about issues women and girls face everywhere. This year's topic, the impact of climate change on Indigenous women around the world, is an issue that is close to my heart. My pueblo is the site of one of the largest open pit uranium mines in the world, and I've seen people suffer from the impacts of that mine on our water, our health, and our community. As I record this message in February, the impacts of a global pandemic, economic crisis, racial injustice, and climate crisis have highlighted the disparities in access to healthcare, education, unemployment, and even food and water in Indian country. It's crucial that we recognize the importance of Indigenous voices and values as we combat climate change. As the original stewards of these lands, tribal communities have developed practices and methods to protect our environment. Indigenous people have known for generations that if we don't have a planet, we don't have anything. When we listen to and involve Indigenous leaders as we plan ways to protect our land for future generations, we can heal our country and our earth. I'll do all I can to continue to leave the ladder down for the next generations of Native women, ready to lead and do their part in stopping this climate crisis. While we face difficult times, I'm confident that together we'll all step up to the challenges of today and build back better for tomorrow. Thank you again. Thanks for having me, and be fierce.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 Justice for Women lecture at the University of Maine School of Law. What a wonderful message from the newly appointed Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland. Her appointment is historic. She's only the 3rd woman to serve in this role, and she is the first Native American cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Congratulations, Secretary Haaland. I'm Dean Lee Softly. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative for their generous support of the lecture this year, and I'd like to thank all of our community members for working with Kathy Lee to make many Justice for Women lecture complimentary programs this week possible. I add my congratulations to both our 2020 and 2021 Courage is Contagious Award recipients, Blanca Santiago and Donna Loring. There's more in your digital program about the Courage is Contagious Award and these deserving awardees. And the presentations of the awards to Donna and Blanca are coming up after our panel of amazing speakers. And before we move to the panel, I want to take a moment to recognize Kathy Lee and the Lee family. The Justice for Women lecture series owes its origin and its vitality to Kathy. Through Kathy's vision, her persistence, and the tireless work of the JFW team, Maine has had enriching access to women throughout the world who are on the front lines of the global struggle for justice. Kathy's unflagging commitment to justice for women and girls everywhere has inspired us all. Through the annual Justice for Women lecture, the University of Maine School of Law celebrates equality and justice for women and girls the world over. Over the past 10 years of JFW, Maine Law has hosted Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez from Mexico, Miriam Jalabi from Syria, Zaina Anwar from Malaysia, Lindway Sibanda from Zimbabwe, Ruchira Gupta from India, Dr. Seema Samar from Afghanistan, the Honorable Albie Sachs from South Africa, Nobel Peace Laureate Lema Gabawi from Liberia, and the Honorable Unity Dow from Botswana. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining us today to engage in a much needed conversation about the impact of climate change on Indigenous women. The topic of climate change, and especially its impact on Indigenous women and families, is a topic that's critical to Maine, as well as the rest of the nation. It's our hope that this lecture will encourage all of us to reflect on our own fundamental questions and concerns about climate change and how it connects to human rights, equality, and justice. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists. Please note if you'd like to pose a question to our panel as part of the discussion, you can submit through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any point during this event. And now, it is my privilege to welcome Joan Naviyuk Kane. Joan is an Inupiaq author of several collections of poetry and prose and is on the faculty of Harvard, Scripps, and Tufts universities. Joan has worked extensively with tribes, Native corporations, nonprofits, foundations, and government and intergovernmental clients throughout the Northern Globe. Her poetry is beautiful and evocative, and we're so fortunate to have Joan's voice today. She will get us started with a reading. Thank you, Joan.
I am called for my namesake, Naviyuk. My family is from King Island and Mary's Igloo, Quannah, Alaska. I'm going to read 4 poems this morning, and I will begin with the poem that you will hear 4 names in Inupiaq, and these are the names of my female relatives, my family who came with me to King Island in 2014, and they are the names of our ancestors as well, our namesakes. The incident light. I went for relief of the mind to move into currents of worry. I did not know what the body held. I thought I would turn through broken ice and disappear the features of apprehension, of influence. If only I could betray the brute matter. If only the seas had not erased the facture, ladder, the easy reach. Instead, we sank into soft snow, 4 women ascending together the deep furrow worn by water, returning to water. Ayaraduk, Uyuruluk, Yayuk, Navayuk. I was startled, at once aware that the far road had fractured, done under by the fault we fought to bury. Land arises beyond a trouble of strong currents. The boat that bears us rises in them. With invisible stars, we share blood. Those seas increased might scour and reflect. Those seas increased rephrase us. This is a short poem called Hyperboreal. Arnica nods heavy-headed on the bruised slope. Peaks recede in all directions in heat haze, evening in my recollection. The shield at my throat ornamental and worse. We descended the gully, thrummed into confusion, with the last snowmelt a tricklet into mud ulterior. One wolfbane bloom, iodine hued, rising on its stalk into the luster of air. June really isn't June anymore, is it? A glacier's heart of milk loosed from 1,000 summer days in extravagant succession, from the back of my tongue, dexterous and sinister. The dissolve of voices. There are 7 moons tonight, and somehow bows beyond the scaffolds. In the streets, she was lost to me. In the streets, I have imagined light, a kind of it, though it too has long since vanished. It cannot be summoned through fire or smoke or other oblivions, as all the men fall away like snow, settling into new designs of havoc until sifted anew in gusts, in passing. After all, I look down and do believe evasion is not a home. In the wing bones, a susurration, a squirrel snare for our relations, a reason for the patterns of our movements, dances, a truss of staffs bound with bands stained by alder, the rivers glossal, a mask subsumed in a mass of stones that seems something like a man, bladder, blood, and lung of a bear dropped from exhaustion, a love absolute of places once unknown to me. Auch narusam isi vibe, ranach duet, anirach, misitavik, uvat, hasanayet, panerawak. In a warm room, we were altered together. beyond this, comprehended for a plural. And this is the last poem I will read. In Inupiaq, the title is Nunaktirit, which can be translated in English to people related through common possession of territory. And I think of our shared relationship to land and ice and water when I think of this word, Nunaktirit. The enemy misled that missed the island in the fog. I believe in one or the other, but both exist now to confuse me. Dark from dark, snow from snow. I believe in one craggy boundary, knife blade at the throat's slight swell. From time to time, the sound of voices as through sun-singed grass, or grasses that we use to insulate the walls of our winter houses. Walrus hides lashed together with rawhide cords, so warm within the willows ingathered forced into leaf. I am named for your sister Naviyuk Kane. Surely there are ghosts here, my children sprung from these deeper furrows. The sky of my mind against which self-betrayal in its sudden burn fails to describe the world. We who denied the landscape and saw the light of it, leaning against a stone wall, ragged, I began to accept my past, and as I accepted it, I felt and I didn't understand. I am bound to everyone. Iranamik, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to share this time with you today.
Thank you, Joan. That was lovely, beautiful poems. I want to add my welcome to everybody. And before I introduce our moderator, I just want to say that many of us are coming to you from the state of Maine, which was settled on land belonging to the Wabanaki Confederacy. Now to our moderator. Jaclyn Estes is a national correspondent for the Alaska Bureau of Indian Country Today, an online news platform. Since 1990, she's worked as a reporter for several radio stations in Alaska and at Minnesota Public Radio, as well as being Public Communications Director for the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. Earlier, she worked in coastal management, and as a historian, she has a BA in history from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Thank you, Jaclyn. Take it away.
Thank you, Kathy. So it was so moving to hear Joan read her poetry, and in part because I'm from Alaska, as she is, and some of what she described is so personal to me too. So I'd like to now ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Quannah.
Hi. Hi. Good morning. Well, it's morning where I'm at. I'm Quannah ChasingHorse. I'm 18 years old. I am Hangguchin from Eagle Village, Alaska, and Ogallala Lakota from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. I'm a climate warrior, land protector. I work a lot with Indigenous women on a lot of these issues and topics that we're about to talk about today, and how a lot of these issues are very interconnected, along with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And yeah, I'm also a new IMG model, so a lot of the stuff I do lately has a lot to do with the fashion world, but it's awesome because everywhere I go, I get to educate everyone, and they're so intrigued. So that's what I love about what I do. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. Galina?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. My name is Galina Angarova. I am an Indigenous woman, Indigenous rights activist, climate activist, and I come from the Abzai clan of the Ihiri nation of the Buryat peoples in Siberia. And my people, Buryats, we've lived on the shores of Lake Baikal since time immemorial. and on both sides of the lake. And this is the largest freshwater lake in the world, containing 20% of the freshwater. And we have our own culture, distinct culture, language, and way of life. And today I'm speaking from the lands of the Ohlone people, where I currently live and work, and which is now known as the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also the executive director of Cultural Survival, and we are an almost 50-year-old Indigenous rights, Indigenous-led organization, and we work to protect Indigenous people's rights, self-determination, cultures, and political resilience. And I come to this work with experience of being an on-the-ground organizer, campaign organizer, working mainly against resource extraction projects, gas pipeline mining, oil pipelines, hydro dam development. And I also used to represent the Indigenous Peoples constituency to the United Nations on Sustainable Development Goals from 2013 to 16. And as a grant maker, working in philanthropy, and today as the executive director of Cultural Survival. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. Sherri, let's hear from you next.
Kwe, andali wisi wana hamu gwasat na geo banowabskewi, solda dona bamo gawasus no banowabskewi nagakakagus no tibayak, guanode wabanakiek. Welcome to everyone from Wabanaki territory, which is where the University of Maine is located. My name in my language is Wanahamugwasat, and I am from the Penobscot Nation. I'm an attorney and an author and teacher, and I'm the executive director of an organization called the Land Peace Foundation. The Peace Foundation is primarily focused on the preservation of Indigenous land and water rights and the protection and preservation of the Indigenous way of life. And so some of the work that I'm doing in relation to climate change, I've contributed to a couple of books on climate change. One, All We Can Save book, which I actually have a copy of right here. And then another one called Resetting Our Future, which really looks at climate action in the United States. And that was put together by the team that I'm working on, who has developed a framework under the UNFCCC for, which falls under Article 6 and then Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, to create a strategy framework for climate action on the ground in the United States. And our proposal has just been accepted by the Biden administration, and one of our team members has been named the national focal point for the US ACE program. And so I'm very happy to be a part of that work. Also teaching courses for the Global Council on Science and the Environment. And I've worked with Project Drawdown on looking at climate change adaptation and mitigation, and with some large multinationals, helping them to decolonize their conservation efforts and their Indigenous land guardianship programs and land protection programs, so that it helps to bring forward the voices and the best interests of the Indigenous peoples. So thank you for having me. Happy to be with all of you.
Thank you and welcome. And Sara.
And thank you for the invitation to this panel. I truly have been looking forward to take part in today's event together with all of these magnificent and powerful women. I'm Sara from Greenland. I'm Inuk. I'm a former politician. Today I'm a scientist. I'm doing a Ph.D. on Greenland and US relations in a security perspective. But I think most of the issues that I will be talking on today will be from my experience from politics as a woman, as an Indigenous woman, and also all of the issues that are tied in different ways to climate change, the issues of our living resources, the issue of mining, the issues of how to raise awareness in our local communities, for example, on the issue of climate change in a country as Greenland, where we see and feel the changes on our own, in our own everyday, but still it's not a very big part of the everyday debate. So this awareness raising and being a politician, as I was for 7 years, all of the dilemmas that you can enter into when you, as an activist, whereas I was more a politician than an activist, but trying to push for the agenda of mitigating climate change and making sure that our land and our people can strive and survive for generations to come. So the agenda of securing sustainability, the agenda of making sure that we as Indigenous peoples ourselves also take part in the struggles to fight climate change. So I look very much forward to the debate today. And today I'm here, of course, as a PhD fellow, but I'm also the chair of the Greenland Human Rights Council and a delegate in the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And I very much look forward to the questions and the debates.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I know you're all really busy, and I've been looking you up on the internet, and I'm filled with admiration for each of you for all you're doing. So what we're going to talk about today, what we hope to get out of this is to show people, to have you serve as role models so that other people can see what they can do. They can get ideas about what they can do, how they can be engaged with their community, how to mitigate climate change, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I was struck with when Joan was reading her poetry was very much about the sense of place. And I think that's something that's very powerful for Indigenous people. I'm going to go to you next, Sara. And when I think of place, I also think of sovereignty. And Greenland is right in the middle of momentous change, becoming sovereign, more sovereign from under Denmark. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And then how do you see sovereignty linked to climate change?
Mm. Well, in the case of Greenland, with our self-government agreement, which is a law that is passed in both Denmark and Greenland, giving Greenland, for example, the right to declare ourselves independent at some point in the future, it is actually a very high degree of self-determination that we are exercising, which of course gives us both the right to be the decision makers on a very wide range of areas, including, for example, the issues of mining, the whole area of fisheries and business development, education, health, social affairs. Everything is something that is decided in the Parliament of Greenland. This very wide range of right to self-determination also comes with a responsibility, of course, to develop Greenland. And here we find all of the very interesting dilemmas. We had a general election last week, both for the parliament and for the municipalities. And as I told you previously, I have been a politician, and I must remind you that, of course, I will be quite biased, but it has been such an incredible week that has passed after the election. Personally, for example, I have been very much opposing the plans for a uranium mine in South Greenland, an open pit uranium mine. I have met with people and heard their struggles and their worries about these plans for a very big open pit mine, both the ones that have the very strong environmental concerns, but also the ones that were saying, well, this is a chance for Greenland to have economic income for furthering the self-determination and implementation of that right. So there has been a lot of struggles in Greenland for the past more than 10 years. And the election last week ended up really being an election on the issue of uranium, because there was one party left, which was the party that I have previously been the leader of, that was very, very clear on its opposition to the uranium mine. And we saw that the people of the town of Naksaq, which is the small town in South Greenland, next to which this mine was being planned to be established, they voted 72.5% for that particular party that says no. So the election has really been interpreted now by the politicians across the board as the people saying that we don't want an open pit uranium mine, but it is an example of this process of moving towards greater and greater sovereignty, in the end, also sovereignty, and moving towards greater and greater self-determination, where you run into these struggles and where you as a people have to ask yourself, which path do we want to choose? And I have been very moved over the last week seeing the Inuit Ataqatigiit Party win the election, and now having giving the people a chance actually to, for example, decline a very big open pit mine, although other sides of the debate, of course, are highlighting the opportunity or the mine as an opportunity to develop the economy further. So we as Indigenous peoples and us that engage as activists or politicians, we do run into these dilemmas all the time. And I think that is one of the things that especially women in politics are very good at balancing. One thing that I was worried to see at the election last week is that only 1/3 of the elected members of both the parliament and the municipality are women, and that is not enough. So there's still a struggle to do to have more women wanting to take the responsibility and be the leaders of their own nations. Quannah.
Thank you. So I think as we get into this conversation, we're going to discover more and more how much we have in common. And I feel like Greenland is a kindred spirit to Alaska in several ways. One is your strategic location in between Europe and North America. And Alaska is kind of in between North America and Asia. So Quannah, my next question is going to be for you. And the other thing that Alaska has in common with Greenland is resource development. And this has been a critically important issue for your people. And I'd like to hear from you to tell us how you found your voice in speaking out for the Gwich'in Athabascan.
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in the movement. My mom and my aunties, my mom was a single mother like most of my life, so I only had her. And she really taught me everything that I know. And I was raised around powerful matriarchs, powerful women within this movement. And, growing up around that and seeing them be so graceful in their power with their voice, with the work that they do, inspired me. I was constantly sitting at the table with them when they would speak about these issues. And I always wanted to be a part of it, but I never knew how. And how I really came into my voice was when I was really young, 7th grade. The school district was deciding whether or not they wanted to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And I was the only person that showed up to that meeting. And an elder heard it on the radio that I was the only person that showed up to this meeting to represent Indigenous people. And I was only in 7th grade and I was very intimidated, but by the end of the day, they changed it to Indigenous Peoples Day. It was kind of a struggle because I was the only one to really, stand my ground. I was the only one that really could do anything because I was the only one that was there. After a while, an elder did show up and he backed me up, but I felt, in that room full of non-native people that just wouldn't really understand where I come from or how it affected me as a little girl. But after a while of discussion, they decided that, this young person came here today because she's passionate about this, so we need to change that. And so that's when I really started to come into my voice. And then, later on, I was starting to speak at a few rallies here and there in Alaska. And then I got an opportunity to join the Gwich'in Youth Council. I'm no longer on the Gwich'in Youth Council, but I had amazing experiences. I got to meet amazing people. And when I was with them, I got to go to DC. It was my first work trip. And I met Deb Haaland, I met AOC, I met a ton of congressmen and women, and I spoke with each and every one of them about protecting the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And I was lobbying to protect the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, but also address climate change that was happening in Alaska. So, you know, when I was there and I met these powerful, powerful people, that's when I realized like I could be in that position. I could be one of those people that makes those decisions. And so that's what really, you know, continues my drive and motivation, along with my people, the support, and seeing youth, younger youth, reach out to me and say, hey, you raising your voice and speaking up has inspired me to do so as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. So just to tell, I mean, you guys, I have such a story about Quannah. When we were still able to get together, we would have an annual convention called, and it was put on by the Alaska Federation of Natives. And Quannah introduced a resolution there with Netse Peter. And it was, I'm telling, did I say her name okay?
Yeah, it's Nanej.
Nanej. So that you guys were just in high school, and they introduced a resolution about climate change in front of this huge audience, and people spoke out very strongly against it. And again, you guys stood your ground. And so speaking of people finding their voices, let's go to Sherri. And can you tell us what drives you to be a writer?
First of all, I just want to honor Quannah for her work and for having the courage to stand up. I think that one of the things I find most hopeful in this day and age is the young people who are standing up and who are courageously facing the obstacles to them having a future, because that's really what it is. It's like they are facing the obstacles to their ability to have a future. They don't need to be in that position. We've placed them in that position, and I want to apologize for all those who created the necessity for you to have to stand in that way, and to honor you for standing in that way. So, could you, anyone? When I saw the questions that we were going to be asked, I thought this was an interesting question, considering the title of the panel. Certainly my desire to write, I think, is inborn. I think that for people who that's their way of expression, it's something that just rises up within them. What I have to say has been framed certainly by my experiences as an Indigenous woman. My desire to write, I think, is something altogether different than the framing and the formation of what I have to say. And so the experiences that I've had as a Skijinawak Apid Bunawapskewi, as an Indigenous woman from the Penobscot Territory, is an understanding that I am Bunawapskewi, and that is the name of the river, that's the name of the land, and that's the name of the people. And so we are one and the same. We recognize that there's no distinction between who I am and who the land is and who the water is and who the people are that have existed there since time immemorial. And so when I say that I'm Bunawapskewi, there's an understanding of that interrelatedness there. And the fact that I grew up during a time when we were forbidden from being in the river because of the toxins that were flowing into that waterway from the paper mills that surrounded our reservation. The fact that I couldn't cross over that river on the bridge that led to the adjoining town because of the racism that existed that created an unsafe environment for me as an Indigenous woman, even at a young age. And so growing up in an environment where we're facing issues of environmental racism that are really, in many ways, destroying our capacity to have cultural continuity as riverine culture, and having to deal with really deep-seated racism in the adjoining towns around us helped me to, I think, out of necessity, develop my voice and to, make a commitment to use my voice in a way that would benefit my people. Because, when I was in high school, my grandfather, who founded the Native Studies program at the University of Maine and the Wabanaki Center at the University of Maine, hauled me out of school because the local high school principal was so racist that he refused to allow any Native students to enter into college placement courses because he believed that Indian people were too stupid to go to college, and it was a waste of classroom space to let them in those classes. And so I had to be taken away from my family in order to be able to get an education that would allow me to be able to develop my voice and to develop this, skill, this tool that I've now been able to use to help bring attention to and amplify the voices of my own peoples. And so being raised in that environment and having to work through those struggles of dealing with the type of racism, one of my earliest memories in my community, there's 3 incidents where there was a young man from our community who was in the town adjoining our community on the other side of the bridge, who was walking home and started being chased by the police. He hadn't done anything, but he was terrified of the police, rightly so, because of incidences that had happened in the past to other tribal members. And when they started getting close to him, he realized he wasn't going to make it to the bridge, so he jumped in the river to swim across, and they shot him in the back. There was another incident where there were 4 of our young men from our community who had gone to do ceremony at a place that's sacred to us at Mount Katahdin. And they got beaten up so badly by local KKK that they ended up hospitalized. And so these are the memories of my young life that really drove me to get involved. And then the more I got involved with my own culture, because the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act was passed when I was just a small child. And so in my lifetime, it became legal once again to practice our ceremonies and to speak our languages. And so, coming up during that time when people are reconnecting with those things and bringing them out back into the open, the more I became connected to my cultural ways of being and understood what that was, that Indigenous way of life for us. And this word that I use all the time because it's so important to me in my heart to outline how I now choose to live my life. The way of life, Skidjinaway-Bamosawagin, which is really understanding our interconnectivity and how we walk with who we are forward. The more I came connected to that, the more I understood the importance of that connection to place that you're talking about, and how that connection to place was also tied to the ways in which our environment and our local ecosystems were being impacted by environmental racism and climate change. So all of those things combined are what really led me to do the work that I do in the world. So.
Oh gosh, Sherri, I'm so sorry about the history where you're from. It's something that I think everybody can relate to, especially with what's been going on in the United States. So Galina, later in the program, I'm going to ask you about healing. But first, let's start with how you went from, I looked you up on the internet, and you came from a small community in Russian Siberia, and you went on to work in North and South and Central America and Africa. And I'm just wondering, how did you first, well, there's 2 parts to the question. How did you move from a small community to an international stage? And then the other part to the question is, how did you become a climate change activist?
Thank you for that question. The journey has been long and not very easy, but I'm grateful for everything that I had a chance to experience. I started my activism at a very early age. I was born to a community of about 400 people. mostly my extended relatives, family. I grew up with my grandmother. Her name is Ekaterina. Her native name is Zulma, and I think a lot about her because she was the one who raised me with the stories, and that stories encapsulated the wisdom of our ancestors that were passed from one generation to the next. And as I mentioned, that our village actually is very close to the lake, the sacred lake, and we actually refer to the lake as sacred. And I grew up with a very deep understanding of the interrelatedness of us as people in our environment. In fact, we don't have the word environment in my language. We have a word that's called bedel, which is translated, which is really hard to do in English because it's a very different language from our language. I'm a linguist. My first education is being a linguist, right? And when I studied English, it was really hard for me because it's very structured. And in linguistics, it's called analytical language. And there's subject, predicate, verb, and it's extremely structured, and there's separation, and the language does affect the way you think. But in my language, there's no separation between I and my environment. The bedo, that word I was referring to, it means the state of being with your surroundings. So I grew up with that understanding that, and maybe what Sherri was referring to, if I'm correct, that that we grew up with understanding that my life and my well-being is dependent on the life thriving around us. We are interconnected, and that it's really hard to separate what is me, what is us, and what's around us, and that we're all equal parts of this intricate web of life. And so Lake Baikal was my first love. I fell in love instantly. It's always with me. And there are many legends, stories. Actually, my last name, Angarova, comes from the word Angar. And there's a big river, the only river outflowing from Lake Baikal to the west. And it's actually the name, it has different meanings, but one of them is the species of the bird that lives on that lake. And it always comes in pairs. So it's like if one of the bird in the pair dies, the other one dies too. So I think in many ways, I'm somehow connected with everything that surrounded me as a child. And as a teenager, I participated on a 180-kilometer walk from my hometown to Lake Baikal to protest peacefully against the pulp and paper mill on the southern shore of Lake Baikal. But as a seasoned activist, I participated in a global campaign against Trans-Siberian oil pipeline that was, they were going to build it in the proximity to the lake, to the northern tip of the lake. And that was in the early 2000s, and we did a huge campaign trying to at least move that pipeline away from the lake, which we did collectively. And then later on in life, I realized that my interest in specific issues and so-called environmental activism is not enough, and that it progressed into a different sort of activism, which is now called Indigenous rights activism. But it came from the realization of who I actually was, where I come from, who my ancestors were, and that people and place are inseparable. There is no place without people or people without place. And that I could not keep focusing on separate issues and looking at things in a compartmentalized manner, like we usually do in the Western society, right? It's like, as we are becoming decolonized as Native people, like, okay, this is the way to look. But I think that as Native people, I regionally look at things in a holistic way. My health is dependent on the food I eat, right? I cannot separate conservation from my spirituality, because my ability to go to that sacred mountain and pray is contributes to the conservation, because we're protecting this place this way. So, and I became acutely aware of the fact that Indigenous peoples globally are very similar in their ways, in their relationships to their lands and territories. And that at this point of our history as humanity, as human civilization, we as Indigenous peoples are standing in the way of complete destruction of this planet. I'm going to give statistics why I think that way, is that most biological diversity is on the lands of Indigenous peoples, 80% of the biological diversity, even though we're only 6.2% of the total population. It's 476.6 million people. And that we manage at least 24% of the total carbon stored above ground in the world's tropical forests. Areas titled to Indigenous communities have shown to store 36% more carbon per hectare than public conservation land. And this is just a few stats, but I think in the last couple of years, I see more and more studies proving that Indigenous peoples are the best stewards of our environment. And we are standing in the way of complete destruction of this planet. And we carry that traditional knowledge that came from my grandmother, my grand-grandmother, that we can use for the benefit of the entire planet. And I became the climate activist later in life, after I went through the stage of environmental, Indigenous rights activism, and then that brought me to the climate change activism. And over the years, as I started traveling, visiting our other communities all over the world, it became clear that climate change has become a #1 issue for Indigenous peoples. We are on the forefront and we're bearing all the consequences, even though we are contributing to the solutions for climate change. I see the Arctic communities. We have women from the Arctic communities. People are suffering from the receding sea ice. People are suffering from the loss of their subsistence resources. Communities in Alaska where I also visited, and I spent times with the families. And they were saying that they can have difficulties going out on the ice because of ice thinning. We are experiencing changing climate, changing weather patterns. People in the Himalayas are suffering from the receding ice, which results in huge flows of water during the year, right? And then less water throughout the rest of the year. And then we also seeing my communities in Siberia, in the Amazon and California, suffering from raging fires, which is also the result of climate change. Hurricanes, which is just the 2 Category 5 hurricanes hit the communities in coastal Guatemala, Honduras, in Central America. What about the typhoons that obliterated some villages in the Philippines? So it really told me that Indigenous peoples are in the forefront, even though we are bringing the solutions to climate change. And in 2013, I started participating in COP, and I was assigned to be the lead on the Green Climate Fund, to represent Indigenous peoples to the Green Climate Fund, to include our needs and our language and safeguards for Indigenous peoples in that institution, which is the financial facility for the UNFCCC. So that's my experience, and I'll pause here.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to ask all of you, you've heard each other speak on things that are close to your heart and important. And I'm wondering if any of you have questions for one another or something you want to add to something somebody else said. Sara?
Yes, thank you. And it was so right what was said in the beginning, that it's so recognizable across the board, to hear about some of the issues and struggles from other Indigenous peoples and communities. And I think that since we have the climate change as a main topic here, I think that what it all shows us is several different things. And I just wanted to add with a little bit of information on a survey that was done in Greenland recently, where the people of Greenland were asked what their greatest concerns are in regards to the development of society. And here the economy was the greatest concern. Then came unemployment, and then came higher living costs. And on fourth was the climate change. And it, to me, just also shows the struggles that our people is going through in Greenland, for example, where we have a very high degree of inequity generally in among the population. Besides also the inequalities between women and men that I was talking about before, for example, the low number of women in politics, but also in regards to income, women are still very much below the income of men, even if you count or look at the statistics among people with the same education. So there's something very unequal in the society that we live in, and I hear that it's the same among other Indigenous people. So we really have a struggle within our communities, where I think that climate change is a factor that sort of magnifies all of that. I don't know how many times I have been sitting in political meetings insisting on our, for example, management of the fisheries being based on sustainability, and then sitting in a room with a lot of men who are more concerned about earning the money quickly now, you know. So all of these issues, I think that it's so important to have more women at the tables to balance the decision making and balance the way that you see the world and how you have to make sure that you take care of the world we live in, and particularly among Indigenous peoples, where we see a higher degree of inequity. And then the other thing is zooming a little bit out. I think actually, especially for Indigenous peoples that live in the Arctic, of course, all around the world, but particularly us who live in the Arctic, we are really in a state of and in an era of new, I would almost say, threats to our nations. And if we look at both the geopolitical development, where these great powers are competing, so the US, Russia, China, and that is sort of the order of the day on the high level politics, where it becomes even more difficult for Indigenous peoples and nations and self-governing nations to be at the table and have their voices heard. That is one big struggle. And on top of that, we also see new forms of colonization that happen also because of climate change. So, and here I'm talking about the world struggles to mitigate climate change, making it necessary to develop more and more, for example, green energy. And these green energy initiatives sometimes happening on Indigenous people's land, without the Indigenous peoples being heard or taking into account of the decision making. So I think that at the same time as we have these domestic struggles where Indigenous women are very much under pressure politically and in other ways, we also have these external threats that we will have to deal with and work with and make our voices heard in the years to come. We all want to mitigate climate change, but for example, the Paris Agreement, Greenland did not sign the Paris Agreement. Personally, I would have liked Greenland to sign the Paris Agreement, but simply because it didn't leave space for small nations and take into account the needs of small nations and Indigenous peoples. That was the reason that the then Greenland government gave for Greenland not signing the Paris Agreement. So the world as a whole internationally has not learned yet to take into account us as Indigenous peoples and self-governing nations. And that is something that we have to work so much on in the years to come.
Thank you, Sara. Sherri, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Sara, Galina, and of course, Quannah. And I'm gonna have to leave shortly, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, what's key to what Sara is just talking about, and that is, as we know, the violent removal of the matriarchs from the center of our communities, the removal of the matriarchs from the center of our families, from the center of our societies, from roles of decision making. When you remove the matriarchs, when you remove the mothers from the center, then what evolves around that is a society that is incredibly imbalanced. And I think that everything that we've talked about is evidence of that removal of the matriarchs. And so naturally the solution is bringing the matriarchs back to center. But I want to talk a little bit about these impacts that are related to what both Galina and Sara were talking about, that we have, you know, my opinion on the Paris Agreement, I think we need to be in unification on our means of addressing climate change. I don't agree that it needs to be at the commodification of one of the sources of our survival, primarily our air, which is largely what the Paris Agreement is seated in. And that's, I think, why it got such broad approval, is because it was latched onto a mechanism that's already well accepted within the capitalist society, which is the commodification of the very sources of our survival, which is certainly not the way forward that we need. But we do need unification. And so looking at the fact that everything that happens, that gets broad approval, is tied to some type of commodification or consumption. And Galina talked about how Indigenous peoples retain, at this point in time, 80% of the, you know, diverse biodiversity on the planet. Some of the last remaining untouched ecosystems that exist in the world are in the hands of Indigenous peoples, which is worrying because, you know, there's certainly a move to get involved with the protection of Indigenous lands and Indigenous land guardianship, which concerns me about the taking of those lands for their protection as we move deeper into climate change, which when you think about it, doesn't make any sense when we're thinking about mitigation strategies that are tied to mining for lithium batteries, that are destroying the earth, that are forcibly removing Indigenous peoples from their lands, where you have that things that are tied to green technology leading to further destruction of the planet. When you have adaptation practices that are being imposed upon Indigenous peoples who are on the front lines of impacts of climate change, adaptation strategies that are moving them from their traditional way of life that's in alignment with the sustaining of life and the sustaining of ecosystems and our environment into some type of market-based economy system for their own benefit, right? This is helping them to adapt to climate change by actually moving them into alignment with activity that's caused climate change. It's absolutely insane. And so when we're thinking about how do we address these issues, how do we, you know, rightfully find mitigation and adaptation strategies that are in alignment with what our goals are, the Indigenous peoples already have the answers because we've been living that way of life for millennia. We have clear examples of how you do that. It's just not tied to the same value system as the capitalist value system that has emerged. And so when you think of yourself as being either a commodity or a consumer, then your value system can't be aligned with the sustaining of life because it's aligned with an exchange system that's monetarily based. And so there has to be a fundamental shift in value systems in order for us to adequately address climate change. And Indigenous peoples have those value systems intact. And so we have a great deal to offer to these discussions going forward. And I think that that's a really important piece of the puzzle when we start thinking about what is most needed to address the destruction of the planet. The matriarchs are needed. Those who who give life. The life givers, the life nurturers, the life cultivators, the life protectors need to be the ones who are in charge of decision making if we want to sustain life. So I just want to add that much to give a chance for the others to comment before you go to Q&A. So Kachi, Willie.
Thank you. Thank you. So earlier we heard from Quannah, and I think we were all inspired by seeing someone young work, jumping into this. And I'm wondering, for those of you who have been engaged in activism for decades in some cases, if you have any advice for someone like Quannah, any tips. And part of it is how do you stay strong? How do you heal? And I think, how do you make your voice most effective? Sara?
Well, for me personally, I both had, prior to my time in politics, if I sort of look at the time that I have spent of my life being engaged in promoting Indigenous people's rights and being engaged in the development of Greenland and being engaged in sort of trying to bear some of the burden of the developments of Greenland. One thing that has always been center for me is to maintain my integrity and also to sort of take that time to think things through for myself and listen to my own sort of both heart and mind. But it all boils down to maintaining the integrity, because when you're in the heat of debates, or you're in the heat of very big questions that you need to find a solution on, listening to all of those other people around you, you most often find the most strong integrity in looking inwards and trying to gather all of the messages that you have received from everyone around you. And then listen to that in integrity. And that is also what will keep you strong in regards to standing tall through all of those struggles that we women who take leadership do meet. And we meet them everywhere. So it is something about maintaining a core in yourself and maintaining that integrity, saying no when you have to say no, and then choose your battles very wisely.
Thank you, Sara. So Quannah, I want to ask you if you have any advice. And actually, I'm wondering what gives you hope, what helps you stay engaged and keeps you moving forward with this. And then we'll go to Galina to talk about healing a little bit, if that's okay. So Quannah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm new to it, pretty new, pretty young. But I've learned a lot, and through everything I have grown this platform. And the other day I got attacked by another Indigenous woman in my own community. As Indigenous women, we all have, and just Indigenous people in general, we all have this amount of trauma, generational trauma, and our own personal trauma that we all go through and experience in our journeys. And one thing that I have always turned to when I feel lost or confused or afraid or anything, doubt of any kind, I go outside and I take a deep breath and reconnect my thoughts with the lands, my ancestors, and what I usually tell younger generations when they feel that way is, it's because you're disconnecting yourself from your ancestors, from your traditions, from your culture, and from your identity as an Indigenous person. And I always found myself, whenever I felt that kind of way, going outside, but not just that, but, touching and feeling things outside, because that is one way I reconnect. That is one way I find healing. And that's one way I find healthy ways of coping, is going outside and reconnecting myself. And also staying grounded with my values and my identity as an Indigenous person. It can be challenging sometimes, especially having a huge platform. You can get lost in social media, you can get lost in politics, you can get lost in, so much. This society carries so much. And as we start to see Indigenous people coming to the forefront and people are starting to really uplift our voices, and our movements and what we have been fighting for, we are starting to see a lot more community and everyone coming together. And so, what really gives me hope is seeing, obviously a ton of Indigenous women like we see here.
Quannah, sorry to interrupt, but Sherri has to leave. So we just wanted to say thank you so much. And good luck with everything you're doing. See you again sometime, I hope. Okay, Quannah, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
I was just saying that what really helps me and gives me hope is when, I'm speaking at an event or just talking to, like the other day, we spoke with high school students and seeing how engaged and intrigued they are and wanting to learn and understand, Indigenous people and our culture, but also understand that we have a different kind of connection to this earth. And we have always fought for the earth. And so growing up, I was raised in the movement, but I was also raised in my ways of life. I grew up hunting, fishing, dog mushing. I learned how to beat, I learned how to sew, I'm learning my language. All of those things really contribute to not just my identity, but like who I am as a person and why I feel so motivated and driven. And it's just awesome seeing younger voices and younger people wanting to learn more about their culture, starting to be proud of who they are, because in this society, we're just now starting to see people accept us. Just a few years ago, I went to a really non-Native high school, and I was one of the only Native students there, and it was really, really hard on me. And when I left that school and I went to a culture-based school where it was a Native school and I got to learn my language, and I saw the Native students there thriving and really wanting to engage in their cultures and traditions, that's what gives me hope, because then I see the future generations really starting to step up and use their voices as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
I'm going to step in now and move us to audience questions, because we have far more questions than we're going to be able to ask and give you an opportunity to answer. But thank you, all of you, for your thoughts so far. The first question, and if you have questions in the audience, put them in the Q&A function and we'll get to as many as we can. For Sara, what can we in the environmental movement do to withdraw our support for green energy that is at the expense of Indigenous land and sovereignty? Here in New York, we oppose the Hydro-Quebec large hydro project, which would flood native land, but what else can we do?
Well, I think it is about, first of all, of course, listening and engaging with Indigenous peoples and making sure that when you're on Indigenous land, the decision on how to use that land and resource is being taken by the Indigenous people who owns that land and resource. So that is the most important thing. And I also wanted to add that, for example, in Greenland, now there's a big opposition to uranium mining, but that doesn't mean that there's a big opposition to other kinds of mining. We do have, for example, today both we have been through history been mining different kinds of resources, rubies, gold, anthracite. There's a possible zinc mine in the very northern part of Greenland, and other minerals. So the point is that the decisions are taken by the indigenous peoples themselves. And that is the whole idea, of course, of self-determination. I know that it is difficult and might be more difficult than our situation in Greenland, where we are in majority in our own country. We have our own parliament, we have our own government. But that is the core issue. That is that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. And with that right to self-determination also comes, the very, very important point of letting the indigenous peoples be the decision makers on these issues. So the most important thing I would say is that if you're an outsider looking into to these issues on indigenous land, it is to try to understand and engage directly with the peoples that is affected. And of course, then, it's always good, I think, having, grown up in Greenland, where there's so many researchers, so many journalists, so many outsiders coming into Greenland to tell the story of Greenland. The most important thing is to let the people tell the story themselves.
Thank you, Sara. So, and I want to say to the audience, thank you so much for the questions that you're posting. They're really interesting. And so let's see, I'm not sure. I see a couple of questions for Sara. Well, whoever wants to answer this. In addition to enthusiasm about younger women finding and using your voices, what are you doing to honor older women who faced different kinds of obstacles and who are still finding their voices? Galina, does that sound like something you could speak to? How can we honor elders who have been through these kinds of battles and help them find their voices?
I think I would like to connect that to healing too. That you wanted to ask me a question about healing, and I think it's a very important subject. First of all, like connecting even to the other question regarding what advice we have for young Indigenous women. I think like in my culture, we were told that we were born complete into this world, that all the answers are actually within. And I see that in you, Quannah, that you already have all the answers within, that you are already born with that wisdom that comes from your ancestors. It's just a matter of revealing that wisdom. I also believe that in my culture, we say, if we gather 100 women in one space, there's nothing that can stop us from materializing things into reality. And I think we need to do that as Indigenous women, getting together in spaces like this and envisioning, materializing things into reality. But in order to be able to do that, we also need to heal. I know that we're coming with hundreds of years of trauma that has been passed to us from our ancestors. And that's the reality, unfortunately. And how I've been in this journey all my life, the process of decolonization and indigenizing myself back to my roots, back to my original instructions. And that process is actually reflected in your physical brain, in your neuropaths, the neuropaths that you have to unbuild, unwire, and then rewire through deep reflection, through breathing, through trauma releasing. I personally have been able to penetrate a lot of the trauma, both mine, personal, and the trauma that has been passed down to me for generations. It's not an easy process, but I think it's completely worth it, not being afraid to stay with it and realizing that, there's something beautiful on the other end. There's something beautiful and empowering, and that will give you a tremendous amount of energy. And we need that energy to move forward. We need that energy to stand up for our rights, to stand up for our lands and territories. So I encourage everyone to do the deep inquiry. You know, there are a lot of modern science in this field, but there's also tremendous amount of traditional knowledge that talks about healing. And maybe another kind of a little advice. I don't like giving advice, but one thing I wanted to encourage, talk to your elders. They drop bombs of wisdom all the time. And sometimes we'll look at that wisdom, you know, we can understand it on a superficial level. But over time, that wisdom has layers and layers and layers and layers. It's never ending, you know. Talking to your elders, you know, just having casual conversation. They're just, and maybe to your question, you talked about the older women. Again, we are born into this world complete, and it's just a matter of unraveling, of finding that wisdom within you that has always been along inside. Yeah, maybe that.
Galina, thank you for addressing that question. We've had multiple questions saying, ask Galina more about healing. So thank you. I want to pose this question to anybody who wants to answer it, all of you. How do we reconcile the need for matriarchs to serve as the center of their communities and also seek more leadership positions in politics? Essentially, how can Indigenous women hold the power, be the leaders, but share the workload with others? How can men and non-Indigenous folks be effective allies?
Sara, this seems like a good question for you, but anybody else want to jump in?
Did you have a comment, Quannah?
I was just thinking about that really hard, and I feel like I can relate, and my mom can relate to you in ways, because my mom, she was the only Native female police officer, and she had to work with the Alaska State Troopers, who are all non-Indigenous men, and she really had to deal with a lot of racism, a lot of hardships working with them. But since she was chief of police for her territories and stuff, she had to work a lot with them, and it was really hard for her because none of them really wanted to do the work. And especially if you're working in Native communities, you have to do the work so that you're creating more spaces for these people to heal, to do better instead of cause more harm in these communities. So that's just what I was thinking about.
And to that question on how to engage, how to make sure that more women engage in politics, it's a really, really difficult question. For example, Greenland considers itself as part of the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Faroe Islands, all have a relatively high degree of gender equality. But we see that the struggles in Greenland are so massive in regards to women's rights. Greenland actually was recently under examination by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in the UN. And from the Human Rights Council of Greenland, we did an intervention and also contributed to the parallel reports on the rights of women and the conditions for women in Greenland in that process. And one of the things that we through that process also recommended is that there is more thorough surveys done on what are the conditions in politics that makes it difficult for women to be in politics. There's both the issue of sexism, male chauvinism. There's the issue of situations where you can actually, as a woman, run into being questioned whether you should have an opinion on, for example, fisheries or construction or these areas. So there's also an element of a culture that needs to sort of, and a way of thinking that needs to change in the whole society on how you view women. In Greenland, we live in a society where more than 60% of women have experienced violence or threats of violence, and most of this is domestic. So it's a serious, serious problem. We have a high rate of sexual abuse of girls and women. And we have these issues that are, the numbers unfortunately are continue to be very, very high. And this is a country that considers itself as being part of the sort of Nordic welfare model, where you would see a relatively high gender equality. So there's a really big challenge in regards to, I think, holistically looking at how we as a society view gender, and how we actually try to get rid of prejudice and you know, maybe even having been indoctrinated through upbringing that men and women are not equal, and that is a really, really difficult task. I have experience from politics as a single mom, and I just want to say that being a parliamentarian as a single mom, I was member of the Danish Parliament representing Greenland, and then I was also a member of the Greenland Parliament. The way that in practical terms, the way that the Parliament worked at that time, and probably still very much, is just not organized so that you as a single mom can make things go if you don't have a lot of support. So I can't count how many times I have had my daughter with me at my job, sitting and waiting for me in some kind of a debate at the offices of the parties. So there's a lot of structural things that need to change for more women to enter into politics, but there's definitely also things about how we view each other as men and women, and all the sexes in between, how we view each other as human beings, and how we actually make sure that equality is truly reached, because we don't experience equality today, neither gender equality or other kinds of equalities. And I just also want to add to this comment, and this goes on both how to be a woman, but also being Indigenous. There's no only one right way to be a woman or one right way to be Indigenous. There's endless numbers of ways of how to be a woman and how to be Indigenous. And that, you know, embracing that diversity is more or less also what our societies should be working on, you know, to embrace the diversity and embrace all genders in all of the work that we do.
Thank you, thank you. So Kathy, I understand we're out of time. So I would like to say thank you so much. And well, Galina, I see you have your hand up. Can you say something very quickly?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the questions was, how can you be an effective ally to Indigenous people? And my short answer would be, please, I think we need people to educate themselves about the Indigenous issues. Next week is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. There are plenty of side events about every topic that concerns about Indigenous issues. But being an ally doesn't always mean giving financially, but that too. But, you know, supporting us on social media, introducing your family members, sit down with your family members to talk about Indigenous issues, celebrate with us, you know, support us in many kinds of ways, because support comes both in financial ways and non-financial ways, but first and foremost, educating yourself.
Thank you, thank you. And it's been an honor to be in this discussion with you. And now I'll toss it to Kathy.
Thank you. And thank you again to all of our panelists on this question of being effective allies. One of our young speakers earlier in the week at a different event said, listen with the intent to understand is the place to start. And I thought that was so wise. You know, it's been quite a week for Justice for Women, and it's not over yet. This lecture is actually the 9th event of Justice for Women so far. There are 2 more tomorrow. The lecture is always the highlight, and this lecture, because of the topic, which is so timely and so urgent, and our panel so impressive, we have attracted a record turnout. We had 1,150 people register for this event from 16 countries and 27 different states. I want to quote one of the younger speakers from earlier in the week also, who said, "Change is inevitable, but justice is not." And so every year, Maine Law's Justice for Women program not only offers this lecture, but we go out into the community to talk about issues of justice. As I said, this is the 9th event. All told, we'll have 11 events, 23 amazing women sharing their experience, understanding of the impact of climate change on Indigenous and other communities of color. We started the program this year with a conversation between Maine elders and youth to talk about what we can learn from Indigenous cultures, which, as Galina told you, have used storytelling to pass along their ecological knowledge and their commitment to caring for the land, to never taking too much from the land as we seek solutions to the climate crisis. We've had 3 events with and for young people in a first ever collaboration between Justice for Women, the Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, and the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative. Our speakers were Indigenous or women of color from Maine, Alaska, Kenya, descendants of the Igbo tribe of Nigeria, and Kurdish minority of Iran. I do want to thank Reza Jalali of the Welcome Center and Jono Anzalone of KCI for collaborating in those events. We've had conversations at Tree Street Youth in Lewiston, Deering High School, where Quannah was one of our speakers and really got people very excited about the work she's doing. South Portland High School, where we talked about climate justice, racial justice, disproportionate impacts of climate on Indigenous communities, communities of color, poor communities, and how we can and must come together to fight these injustices. Now, for all of you who have attended past Justice for Women lectures, you know that this is the moment when I tell you that we're so grateful for your support. And a special thanks to KCI and all of the other donors this year who are listed in your program for your financial support for JFW's events this year. You know, we started 10 years ago with a very small endowment and a hope that people in Maine would see the value of Maine Law bringing you this program every year. And we had a dream that we could eventually raise $500,000, which is what we would need to make the program permanent. Well, we're getting there. We are just under 410,000. And yesterday, a longtime Justice for Women supporter came forward and offered to match dollar for dollar every dollar contributed from today at the conclusion of the lecture until tax day, May 17, up to $15,000. So with your help, we could be at 440,000, close to the finish 1 month from now. So please, if you can, support the continuation of this program. Unlike past years, this year there will be no law students standing at the doors of Hannaford Hall to accept your donations. But I was just told before we started that when you leave the webinar, Zoom may take you directly to the JFW endowment giving page, where you just click on make a gift. And if for some reason it doesn't, you can find a link to the donation page in the chat. Just click the donate now button and help us keep these conversations about justice for women and girls going. I want to thank all of you. And now please stay with us for just a few more minutes while we listen to the powerful and personal remarks from the 2020 and 2021 Courage is Contagious Award winners, Blanca Santiago and Donna Loring.
Welcome to the 2021 Justice for Women Courage is Contagious Award presentation. I'm Lee Softly, Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. I have the honor today of introducing you to 2 women of courage, Blanca Santiago, our 2020 award recipient, and Donna Loring, our 2021 award recipient. The Justice for Women Courage is Contagious Award is presented annually to an outstanding woman leader who demonstrates a commitment to raising awareness in Maine about the injustices that women and girls have faced globally and locally. The arrival of the global pandemic prevented us from delivering a well-deserved Courage is Contagious Award to the 2020 recipient, Blanca Santiago, and we are so pleased that she's been patient with us to return this year. Also with us this afternoon is the 2021 awardee, Donna Loring. I'm so grateful to both of them for their time here today and their inspiring work through the years. Each of our award recipients for 2020 and 2021 has created a lasting impact in our community through her time, work, talent, and resources. You're about to hear about each of these outstanding women and how they embody this award. To get us started, I'm delighted to introduce Kathy Lee, who you heard about earlier. The Justice for Women lecture series owes its origin and its vitality to Kathy. Through her vision and tireless efforts, Maine Law has the privilege each year to host a distinguished speaker who engages the Maine community in the global conversation about justice for women and girls. Kathy will be presenting our first award today. Kathy.
Thank you, Dean, for that lovely introduction. I am so excited to present the 2020 Courage is Contagious Award to my dear friend, Blanca Santiago. We were all set to present this award last year to Blanca, surrounded by her community at our lecture when the pandemic forced us to cancel everything at the last minute. But we're very proud to have the opportunity to recognize her now. Blanca is a licensed clinical social worker with a part-time private practice that provides accessible and affordable mental health services to BIPOC, LGBTQIA individuals, and others experiencing the effects of structural and societal oppression. Blanca retired last year after a long and successful career as a family resource specialist in the Portland Public Schools, and now contracts with the district to help address issues of diversity and equity in our schools. She supports a new generation of BIPOC social workers and is a consultant to Presente via Mano en Mano. In that capacity, Blanca supports the behavioral health staff that serve Latinx and immigrant communities in Maine. She serves on the board of the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project and the Foundation for Portland Public Schools. She is the founding member and president of El Centro Latino of Maine and has worked on 3 immigration reform campaigns over the last 15 years. Blanca was conferred her Master of Social Work degree at the age of 60 from the University of New England School of Social Work and was awarded her undergraduate degree in organizational leadership just before turning 50. She is the proud mother of 2 men and a woman and abuela to 2 out and proud grandchildren. It is with deep feeling that I recognize Blanca for everything she has done for so long for Maine's Latinx community and for all of Maine. Thank you, Blanca.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you. I want to thank you, Kathy, for this honor, and also the UMaine School of Law for this recognition. And of course, congratulate Donna Loring on being the 2021 Courage is Contagious Award recipient. We must all be brave and courageous in a year marked with unprecedented challenges, a contentious political climate, the murder of George Floyd, and so many other senseless deaths in our non-white communities, not to mention a silent but deadly pandemic. It's no wonder we all feel the enormity of what it is to be courageous. My mom, a courageous woman who was born in poverty on the island of Puerto Rico, died in early death at age 62 and never realized her full potential. I would like to think that she would be proud of me, but I know all she ever wanted for me was not recognition, but happiness. Awards are given to people who have made it to the point of self-actualization, to such a degree that they are recognized by others. I must stop and think about how that sounds. So much courage all around me that is not recognized by others. I think of Maria, not her real name, the young immigrant mother of 3 small school-age children who's not literate in her native language, but would take her children to the library nearly every week, often walking in the cold with 3 little ones, so that her sacrifice in coming here would not be in vain. Her children are readers today. She is courageous. I think about the women who have been exploited, who have faced down domestic violence, poverty, and language barriers in order to give their children a better life. And I think of my own struggles, how my mother before me faced down the same storms without the same access or tools that she was able to put within my reach. There are justice warriors in my midst. Crystal Cron, the young woman who wakes up every day to build a movement that recognizes that only the people can save themselves. Present in Maine is your courageous heart in action, Crystal. Rosie DeBella, whose limitless potential drives her to build connections across communities through her work at Mano and Mano. Betsy, Juliana, Twee, Monique, Josephine, and the other parent community specialists at Portland Public Schools Multilingual Center, whose commitment and dedication in engaging with immigrant families to ensure their children have equal access to education is courageous. Their fearless leader and my Shiro, Dr. Grace Valenzuela, built Make It Happen at Portland Public Schools from the ground up to become the nationally recognized model it is today. The obstacles are so many and the systems often unyielding. We do it anyway. Even without recognition, we do it anyway. Even if we're made invisible, our efforts never recognized, we do it anyway. That is what it is to be courageous. Our BIPOC communities struggle under the weight of policies that threaten our very existence and right to happiness. We need heroes, champions, justice warriors, and to feel that we all belong and are worthy. In El Salvador, water warriors are at work demanding a basic human right to clean water. On our southern border, activists are calling attention to the detention of children, infants, and youth that are being held in inhumane conditions. I think of Anna, a woman I first met when she was 16 years old, and how she has held people to freedom and safety at our borders. People are safe today because of you, Anna. Thank you for your courage. Think of my own daughter, whose battle with systemic oppression is far from over, but she just keeps getting up and doing it anyway. She would never say she's courageous. You are courageous, baby girl. Small and big acts of courage are happening every day with or without recognition. Who am I not to be courageous? Who are we not to be courageous? Is it even a choice when you see the need for education, food, water, clean air, peace in our homes, healthy bodies? Everywhere there is courage we do not notice and that no one recognizes with an award. I didn't expect this award, and now with over a year gone by, the original shock of being a recipient has been replaced with a desire to share it, because I never was brave all by myself. The Courage is Contagious award came at a time in my career that was marked by my retirement from Portland Public Schools to private therapy practice and a new role as a consultant. In some ways, it felt like a recognition of the work I've done all my life. Finally, right? But the more I thought about it, it was more about my mother's work in helping me stand up against bullies when I was 8 years old, and helping me escape domestic violence at the hands of my ex-husband when I was 22. My mother and all the mothers who, without seeking recognition, helped fight battles like these with no tools, little to no positional power or recognition of effort. And that's the face of courage I see when I see Crystal, Rosie, Laura, Betsy, Elba, Berta, Paula, Teresa, Stephanie, Anna, Rachel, and all the young mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and aunts who tend to the children, the sick, the dying, and those in need. People whose very lives are courageous. I see your courage and accept this award today for all of the unseen, invisible people whose acts of courage are not easily seen or recognized as courageous. This award is ours. We are courageous. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanca. That was so beautifully said. And thank you for your patience. It shouldn't take a year for us to present these awards, but a pandemic is a challenging impediment. And it's now my honor and privilege to present the 2021 Courage is Contagious Award to Donna M. Loring. I have admired and respected Donna for years. She's had an amazing career, and she's been a role model for so many people as we've had the opportunity to watch her advocate for true justice in an unflinching and dignified fashion throughout her career. Before Donna was 20 years old, she joined the U.S. Army's Women's Army Corps and headed for Vietnam. Given her skills, it will come as no surprise that she trained as a communications specialist, processing all of the casualty reports for Southeast Asia. She was one of the few enlisted women in the Vietnam War who served in a combat zone. On her return from Vietnam, she entered and graduated from the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, which opened the door to law enforcement, including the Penobscot County Sheriff's Office. Donna ultimately became the first female chief of police for the Penobscot Nation. She's been a long-serving and prominent advocate for tribal justice in Maine. Donna is an elder and a formal council member of the Penobscot Indian Nation. For over a decade, she was the nation's representative to the Maine state legislature. She was appointed aide-de-camp to former Governor Angus King, and she has recently served as the senior advisor on tribal affairs to Governor Janet Mills. Along the way, Donna has excelled as an author and a poet. She wrote In the Shadow of the Eagle, a tribal representative in Maine, from which I learned a lot as a young attorney. Donna now hosts Wabanaki Windows, a monthly show on WERU radio. The University of New England houses her papers and sponsors an annual lecture series in her name. She was awarded an honorary doctorate degree in humane letters by the University of Maine and the Alumni Career Award from the University of Maine Alumni Association. But more than all of this, Donna is a woman who has earned the deep respect and affection of so many in Maine. She is funny, kind, and compassionate, all the while holding firmly and directly to the values that make her who she is. We should all aspire to be like Donna Loring. Congratulations, Donna.
Thank you, Dean Softly and Maine Law School for recognizing my work with the Courage is Contagious Award. We are living in an interesting time for Indigenous peoples of the world. Time stands still. What we said 20, 30, or 100 years ago, we could say today with the same relevance. I've been thinking about the theme of the award. It takes me back to my ancestors who exhibited tremendous courage in protecting our land, demonstrated by the contagious courage of our clan mothers in their guidance and wisdom over the centuries. My thoughts go back to April 15th, 2008, on the floor of the Maine House, when I sponsored a resolution in support of the United Nations resolution recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. I want to share with you my words to that body in support of its passage. I address the House as follows, quote, I bring before you this resolution to support the rights of Indigenous peoples all over the world. As many of you know, the United Nations approved this resolution on September 13th, 2006. The vote was 143 in favor and 4 against. The 4 countries against were the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all countries of colonization. The white government of Australia issued an apology to the land's Indigenous peoples, but did not vote to adopt the declaration as yet. The Canadian Parliament reversed its vote and voted in favor. 148 to 114 on Wednesday, April 9th, 2008. One wonders what moral authority we have to chastise China on its human rights when we have voted against rights for our own Indigenous peoples. When I was trying to think of what to say to this legislative body, I realized that I should have no problem speaking on behalf of Indigenous people of the world. After all, I am one. I come from a long line of Indigenous people who've been badly treated by the majority governments, both federal and state. I come from a people who have lost their lands, their rights, their religion to the majority culture. I come from a people who have fought and died to protect this country. And I come from a people who are the very essence of this country. In 2002, I had the opportunity to travel to Chile with other legislators from all over the United States. We visited the city of Temuco, 2 hours south of Santiago by air. We stayed 2 days in Temuco and visited the city council. They were proud of the social programs the state had made available to the Mapuche. The Mapuche are Indigenous people of Chile, and they were the only people who were never conquered by the Spanish invaders. I asked how many Mapuche were on the council or on any committees. They looked at each other with surprise and said to me, none. I had the same experience when we met with the town council in a small town just outside the city. We then drove into the bush to visit 2 Mapuche villages. I will never forget that experience. Because we were VIPs, we were welcomed in a joint ceremony by the 2 villages. 2 Machi medicine women greeted us. They were surrounded by government officials who were very proud to tell us that government programs were improving the lives of these helpless people, and they wanted us to know that these people weren't really lazy, they really wanted to work. Each government official spoke very condescendingly about the Mapuche, how he or she provided them with what they needed, and this with Mapuche standing there listening with their heads down. I had been asked to speak before arriving at the village, but I had said no because I was not prepared. After hearing these officials speak, I went to our group leader and told her that I now wanted to speak, but only as a member of the Penobscot Nation, not as a legislator. I asked to speak after the head Machi spoke. She was to speak last. She spoke only Mapuche, and her speech was translated into Spanish, then English. I was not sure what I was about to say would insult her, but I felt I had to say something. As I spoke, I watched the expression on her face and still couldn't tell. I said the following: I'm a Native American, a member of the Penobscot Indian Nation from the state of Maine in the United States. We have clan mothers much like your Machi, and they take care of our communities. I wish to give you a message from my people. Never let your spirits be abused. Never give up your language. Never give up your culture. Be proud of who you are. Stay true to your beliefs, and you will win. You could have heard a pin drop. I did not expect any words from the head Machi, but she turned to me and said, "Thank you for coming all this distance, and thank you for your words. I hope that in some way you can help us save our culture." The translator came to me later and said, there is something he did not translate, and that is that she sends the spirits to be with you on your journey home. He said the reason he didn't translate was because the Spanish would have considered that a non-Christian thing to say. Indigenous peoples all over the world are in need of their freedom, including religious freedom and the right to be treated equally as human beings. The Mapuche are also trying to protect their lands against the corporations that are moving in and taking their lands illegally. On our way to the village, we saw a funeral procession. There were many angry people crying and shouting as they carried a wooden coffin down the middle of the street. We found out later that it was the body of a young Mapuche man who was 19 years old, who had been shot by the Chilean police as he protested the taking of his people's land. Medicine women told our delegation this. The government officials wouldn't talk about it. That was just one incident we happened to find out about. I wonder what other abuses they suffer daily. I would like in some small way to help the Mapuche and all the indigenous peoples around the world. Perhaps this vote, which I believe will be the first vote by a US state in support of the United Nations resolution, will be a first step in order that all nations around the world support the rights of indigenous peoples. The United States of America has always stood for freedom and democracy. Many of us have fought and died for those rights. It is unconscionable that the United States voted against the rights of indigenous peoples. I ask you to support the rights of indigenous peoples here in Maine and throughout the world. The resolution was passed in the Maine House and Senate unanimously under the hammer. 2 years after the state of Maine passed the UNDRIP resolution, the US voted to support it with certain conditions. Much work remains to be done, starting here in Maine. It is my firm belief that human rights, equal rights, and sovereign rights cannot be separated. The world cannot be at peace or thrive until these rights are recognized. We need the courage of our clan mothers and strong women leaders. We need this courage to be contagious all over the world now more than ever. Thank you.
Hello, this is Governor Janet Mills. It's a great honor to join you virtually today in recognition of my good friend Donna Loring as she receives the Courage is Contagious Award. As a Vietnam veteran, as a former police chief, state representative, nonprofit leader, and Penobscot Tribal Council member, Donna Loring has served her country, her state, her community, and the Penobscot Nation all her life. As tribal advisor and liaison to this governor, first in recent history, Donna Loring was a highly valued member of my administration, helping to forge progress in tribal relations in significant areas, including prohibiting Native American mascots, establishing Indigenous Peoples Day, reinvigorating the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and implementing the most stringent water quality standards in the country in order to protect sustenance fishing. Crafting the very complicated legislation as well to provide for tribal court jurisdiction for the prosecution of non-tribal members for acts of domestic violence against tribal members. Donna Loring's expertise was also critical in addressing another challenge the tribes in the state of Maine share, the growing threat of climate change. Her leadership, by word, by deed, and by example, have been instrumental in coordinating tribal state communications and partnerships in combating this common threat. I have pledged that my administration will work to prevent and mitigate climate change at every turn, helping all communities become resilient to the devastating effects of our changing climate, and to ensure that our children and grandchildren will enjoy, as we do, Maine's unsurpassed bounty and beauty. So together with the legislature last year, I enacted bipartisan legislation that created the Maine Climate Council, an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan local and state elected officials, and engaged citizens to develop a plan to reduce carbon emissions and achieve carbon neutrality in Maine by 2045. Donna Loring ensured that voices of other tribal members, including Ambassador Moyandena of the Penobscot Nation, were heard in that council, and she insisted at every step that the state focus on those communities that are often left behind through the new Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. The contributions of our tribes are important to our efforts to preserve and protect our earth from the threat of climate change for generations to come. Donna Loring and I also served in the legislature together for, I think, 3 terms. Our discussions in the Judiciary Committee were often energetic, to say the least. She was always an able advocate on a number of issues, always well-informed, and often she brought new light to old issues. We did not always agree, but she was always civil, and I have come to value our relationship on so many levels. We can always talk. I would say she and I have straightened more fences than we have leaned on, that we have repaired more fences than we have damaged, and broken none. Donna, I am truly grateful for your guidance and long friendship. You've given me plenty of advice. I haven't always taken it, but I do value your counsel, and I will continue to seek it. You should be proud of the contributions you have made to bring the state and Maine's tribal nations closer together. As a trusted voice for Maine's Native people, I know you'll continue to advocate on issues facing Maine's tribes, including access to clean water and clean air, and transitioning to a clean energy future that creates good paying jobs. I look forward to continuing to achieve progress on those issues together. Thank you for your hard work, wise counsel, and service to the people of Maine. And congratulations on this well-deserved honor, my friend.
Thank you for joining us to honor these amazing, courageous women who, as you can see, continue to act, to inspire, to lead, and to contribute so much, not only to their own communities, but to all of us in the state of Maine. I want to thank all of you also for supporting Justice for Women. This program started 10 years ago, and with your continued support, will continue in perpetuity. Good night, everyone.